The moment my son Daniel took the bank book I was holding out to him with my trembling hands, the one that contained everything I had, even the money I'd put aside for my funeral, pinching it between his fingertips as if it were a dirty handkerchief, and said, "These few pennies you've saved wouldn't even cover the service charge for our block. If you want to live in this flat, you can't be a burden on us." What echoed in my ears was not just the sound of a mother's heart breaking, but the roar of 40 years of a life being wasted for nothing. When my husband passed away, leaving us utterly alone in this cruel world while Daniel was still in primary school, I was only 25, a young woman with a whole life ahead of her. Yet as I wiped my tears at his graveside, I buried my youth, my dreams, and my womanhood beneath that soil as well. From that moment on, every breath I took was devoted to one thing only: raising my son, without ever letting him feel the absence of a father, without needing anyone's pity, without bowing his head at anyone's door. Neighbors would whisper, "You're a widow at this age. Remarry. Let a man's shadow protect you." But I shut my ears to them. I spent my days ruining my lungs in the dusty air of a textile workshop, and my nights crocheting and sewing until dawn. Every penny I earned, without buying myself even a pair of socks, went straight into Daniel's little savings jar as I repeated to myself, "My son must study. My son must become someone." And in those years, when my bones ached from exhaustion, the only thing that eased the pain was Daniel coming home with his report card, throwing his arms around my neck. Time flowed like water, and when Daniel graduated with top marks from the university he'd worked so hard to enter, and later became a manager at a major company, I felt that all those years of struggle, sleeplessness, and sacrifice had finally borne fruit. I believed I had a great oak tree by my side now, one whose shade I could lean on in my old age, because to me, he wasn't just a child. He was the greatest work I had ever created, my only source of pride, the only safe harbor I had in this life. But ever since Daniel met my daughter-in-law, Emily, and stepped into that polished, showy lifestyle of hers, it felt as though the kind, loyal boy I had raised had vanished. In his place stood someone who measured everything in money, who spoke of nothing but designer brands and luxury holidays, and who looked at me as if I were an outdated, embarrassing detail that needed to be hidden away so I wouldn't disturb their glossy modern world. That day, Daniel's birthday, I woke up early, made the layered cheese pastry he loved so much with my own hands, and set off with the hope that maybe, just maybe, we might remember our old days together. It took 2 buses to reach that enormous gated complex in Surrey, with its towering security fences and intimidating entrances. My heart's excitement gave strength to my tired legs. But when Emily greeted me at the door with that expression, "You again?" all my excitement turned to dust. As she led me into their sterile museum-like living room, perfectly decorated, untouched by any sign of life, she eyed the bag in my hand as though it contained toxic waste. "Mom, you shouldn't have. We don't eat carbohydrates anymore, and Daniel is on a strict diet. You should have told me before coming," she said, making me feel like an unnecessary burden, a piece of clutter on their enormous sofa. The coldness of the pastry I had brought seeped straight into my heart. Later that afternoon, when Daniel returned from work and saw me sitting there, shrunken into the corner of the sofa. That brief flicker of discomfort on his face, followed by his avoiding my eyes and asking, "Hi, Mom, is everything okay? Something happened?" is something I can never forget. Because when your own child looks at you as if to ask, "Why are you here?" it cuts deeper than the heaviest burden or the sharpest blade in the world. At the dinner table, while they talked about business trips, the new car they planned to buy, and the expensive resort they'd visit in the summer, I tried to force down the food on the elegant plate in front of me. And as I sat there, I felt with every fiber of my being that there was no place in their shining world for a woman with calloused hands and worn-out clothes. I was present at that table only in body. My spirit had already been put outside the door.
While the plate still sat untouched on that glamorous yet soulless dining table, I noticed Daniel's shoulders slump, the veins on his forehead stand out, and the way he inhaled sharply as though an invisible weight were crushing him. In that heavy silence, something ancient and instinctive rang inside my mother's heart, an alarm that told me there were things lurking behind their glittering lifestyle, debts larger than anything I could have imagined, unpaid loans, and a reputation on the brink of collapsing. And then Emily. Her face turned chalk white as she stared at the screen of her latest model phone. She bit her lip, leaned toward Daniel, and whispered, "The bank gave us until tomorrow. If they take this place from us, we'll never be able to show our faces in public again." In that very second, time stopped for me, because the thought of my children losing the home they were proud of, losing the roof over their heads, was far worse than any pain I could feel myself. And the only thing that raced through my mind was the rainy day money I had saved for decades. The money I set aside for my funeral fund, my pilgrimage savings, the tiny security I had for my old age. With trembling hands, I reached into the worn market bag I had carried close to my chest for years. As I struggled with the old zipper, an indescribable wave of peace and pride spread through me. Because for a mother, there is no treasure in this world more sacred, more healing, or more real than being able to say to her child in his darkest hour, "Don't be afraid, my son, I'm here. Your mother saved this for you." I was filled with the pure, naive excitement of believing I was about to be the hero who would pull them out of this tight corner. At last, I placed that burgundy, yellowed bank book on the table, directly in front of Daniel's downcast, hopeless eyes. With all the gentleness I could gather into my voice, I said, "Take it, my son. Here is your father's pension savings and all the money I earned from my needlework. It may be just a drop in the ocean of your debt, but perhaps it can soothe one wound, ease one burden." Inside that little book was not just money. It was my life, my labor, my unending, unconditional love. But I had no idea how they would receive this sacrifice. In the brief moment when Daniel took the bank book from my trembling hands and glanced at the number inside, I felt as though the axis of my world had shifted, because while I expected to see even the smallest flicker of gratitude or a single drop of appreciation, what appeared instead was a thin, icy, poisonous smile curving at the corner of his lips, a smile so cold, so cutting, as though a rusty blade had been thrust into my chest and twisted mercilessly. Daniel tossed the bank book back on the table, as if it were a worthless scrap of paper. Looking straight into my eyes, he said, "Mom, are you having a laugh? Honestly, these few pennies you scraped together, forget paying off our debts. They wouldn't even cover 1 month of service charges in this development. They're not even enough for one of Emily's skincare appointments. Take your charity and stop embarrassing us." And that very second, a ringing roar filled my ears. I thought every vessel in my brain would burst. And then Emily. She glanced at the bank book at the far end of the table, the one that held the value of my youth, my sleepless nights, my entire lifetime of sacrifice, with a look of pure disgust, as though it were something contaminated. "Daniel's right, Mom," she said coldly. "We're dealing with figures in the millions. These old-fashioned mattress savings of yours might cover a corner shop tab at best. Please don't bring this up again. You're only making things harder." Her words fell like the final crushing blow, one that pressed me beneath their sparkling chandeliers and reduced my existence to nothing. That night, as I sat there with that bank book in front of me, I realized it held far more than monetary value. It was the tangible symbol of my love, my labor, and my motherhood. And in Daniel's eyes, those things, my love, my effort, my very being, were just as insufficient and pitiful as the money inside it. Something deep within me broke, irreversibly, and I finally accepted with a shuddering horror that the suited, arrogant man sitting across from me had nothing, absolutely nothing in common with the innocent baby I once rocked to sleep during the years of hardship. He had become a stranger, a cold, ruthless man enslaved by money and ambition.
After that venom-filled dinner, I retreated, head bowed like a servant who had been dismissed, into the cold, gray-walled guest room, a room so lifeless that it held not a single trace of anyone ever having lived there. As I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the rejected bank book in my lap as though it were a dead sparrow cupped between my palms, the silence of the storm raging inside me was far more terrifying, far more devastating than the deafening noise of the city outside. As my tears fell drop by drop onto the cover of that bank book, Daniel's mocking smirk and the word charity echoed in my mind. I had saved that money by going through winters without heating, shivering beneath blankets, by buying bruised vegetables at the market because they'll do fine for soup, all while imagining the day that money might save my son's life. But now I realized I had been living in a fantasy of my own making. To my son, I was nothing more than a pathetic, embarrassing old woman, an outdated fool. I was just lying back on the bed, weighed down by that heavy stone in my heart, and planning to escape this hell at the break of dawn, when a sliver of light crept in beneath the half-open door. Then I heard Daniel and Emily whispering in the corridor. I held my breath and listened. What I heard next hit me like a bullet to the skull. Her bringing that money was humiliating Daniel, but the real point is this: if we hand over her old house to the developer, the cash we'll get up front will at least keep the bank quiet for a while, and we can place her in a care home temporarily. There's no need for her to keep living alone in that rundown place anyway. At that moment, as I sat up in the dark, the sadness and hurt I'd felt just minutes before transformed into something icy and horrifying. My son and daughter-in-law hadn't just belittled the money I had scraped together with a lifetime of labor. They were planning to take my home, my only refuge, the place filled with my memories, and dump me in a care home like a piece of unwanted furniture. and they were discussing all this as calmly as if I were a corpse laid out in the next room. It was in that second that I understood the Daniel I had known, my Daniel, was truly dead. What remained was a monster ready to bury his own mother alive for the sake of an inheritance. That night, after hearing my own child and his wife pronounce my death sentence with my own ears, I lay awake till morning, staring at the shadows on the ceiling of that foreign bed, and I felt, with chilling clarity, that the merciful, forgiving mother inside me, the woman who sacrificed everything for her child, was dying a slow, painful death. And in her place, another woman was being born, a colder woman, hardened, alert, one who would now fight for her own survival. When I entered the kitchen in the morning and saw Daniel reading his newspaper as if nothing had happened, and Emily laughing on the phone with a friend about last night's party, their carelessness, combined with the fact that they still saw me as a simple, gullible old woman, made my stomach churn. But I put on a mask I had never worn before, a hard, expressionless face. I buried the volcano of rage inside me deep, deep down, because I now knew the truth. Showing even the slightest weakness to them would be the beginning of my end, and the beginning of that care home room. As I was leaving, Daniel touched my shoulder and said with false concern, pretending he hadn't spent last night planning to make me homeless, "Mom, I've called a taxi. Don't tire yourself with buses. We'll talk next week. We really should go over the details about your house." His hand on my shoulder felt like a scorpion crawling across my skin. I nodded silently and stepped away as quickly as I could from that poisonous touch. Because at that moment, instead of hugging him or spitting in his face, the only thing I wanted was to get out of that flat and away from their filthy plans. I refused the taxi he ordered. Out of sheer defiance, I took the crowded public bus back to my own neighborhood, to the very house they planned to hand over to the developer and demolish. And as I looked at my exhausted reflection in the window, I made a vow to myself. That house was not just 4 concrete walls. It was my independence, my dignity, the last memory of my husband. I swore that before I let those ungrateful creatures who saw me as a useless object to be shoved aside lay one finger on my home, I would burn that house, that money, and everything I had ever saved in my life, but I would never let them take a single penny. Escaping the lifeless care home corner my son had planned to dump me in, I returned to this house, the one I'd built with my own fingernails, brick by brick, each one cemented with the hard-earned sweat of my late husband and myself. And when I leaned my back against the old wooden door and breathed in that familiar scent of dampness and mothballs, I felt it deep in my bones. This smell was my freedom, my independence, my one and only kingdom in this life. And those who wished to steal it from me were waiting at the gates like an enemy army. When I climbed to my bedroom and reached for the deed I had hidden on the top shelf of the wardrobe, a sacred relic I had guarded for years, my fingers trembled as they closed around it. Staring at my name, Fiona Mills, printed across the page, I pressed the paper to my chest as if it were a living thing, because this wasn't just a document. It was the only guarantee of my existence, my dignity, and my right to live without depending on anyone. This deed was not a checkbook to pay off Daniel's luxurious debts. It was the last fortress in which I could shelter until the day I died, where no one could throw me out. As I looked around the rooms my son and his high society wife dismissed as an old dump that needs demolishing, I let my eyes travel across every crack in the walls, every thread in the worn carpet, every teacup in the cabinet. These were not junk. They were my memory, my past, my identity. Trying to remove me from here was no different from killing me. And in that moment, the wounded mother inside me transformed into something else entirely, a female wolf, injured but dangerous, ready to defend her den with teeth and claws. When I finally accepted that I could no longer trust even the privacy of my own home, that the spare key I had once given Daniel meant he could walk in at any moment like a burglar, I gathered all the documents I'd kept under my pillow, the deed, the bank book they had mocked, and every paper that proved I still existed. I hid them deep in the darkest, dustiest corner of the kitchen cupboard at the bottom of an old jar of dried lentils. The shame of having to hide my own property from my own child cut my heart into 1,000 pieces, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling as I fought to survive. A few tense and silent days passed. When my phone lit up with Daniel on the screen, the burst of joy that once made my heart leap was long gone. In its place came a cold dread, like debt collectors pounding at my door, and a deep twisting anxiety in my stomach, because I now knew that the person calling me wasn't my beloved son, but a hunter waiting for the weakest moment of his prey. When I answered, Daniel began with that polished, professional voice of his, softened like velvet. "Mom, you sound terrible. I can't stop worrying about you in that old house. The boiler could break, the roof could leak. I can't sleep thinking you'll suffer there all by yourself." Once such words would have brought tears to my eyes. Now they rang in my ears like a memorized sales pitch, soulless and false, a predator lulling its prey into stillness. As he described the luxurious care home where nurses would attend to me, where the hot water never runs out, it became painfully clear that he wasn't thinking of my comfort. He was trying to remove the one living obstacle standing between him and the developer's cash. He wanted me out, packaged and posted away like unwanted rubbish. The realization clenched my jaw so tightly I thought it would crack. When the call was ending, I gave him neither yes nor no. I simply said, "Well, we'll see, darling. We'll think about it." Neutral, vague, harmless words. I knew my quiet resistance would only make him more desperate. But I also knew this: my battle would not be won by shouting. It would be won by patience, by silence, by pretending to be the fool, because nothing confuses the hunter more than the moment the prey stops running just long enough to transform into the predator. Just after dawn, when the doorbell rang with the harsh insistence of creditors pounding at a debtor's door, my heart leapt into my throat, and the moment I opened it to find Daniel standing there with a stranger beside him, a cold-faced man holding a leather document case, I felt as though it wasn't guests crossing my threshold, but executioners come to sign my fate. Daniel's nervous shimmer in his eyes, paired with his forced cheer as he said, "Mum, look who I've brought, just to make things easier for you," was the clearest, sharpest warning of the disaster creeping ever closer. Spread across my little living room table were piles of papers filled with tiny, ant-sized writing. The cold weight of the pen Daniel shoved into my hand felt like a ton of iron, crushing my fingers. And when he leaned close and whispered, "Mum, this is just procedure, a simple authorization for your luxury care home admission and the protection of your assets. Just sign here and we'll be done with all this stress," I suddenly understood the truth hidden beneath that word protection. What he wanted was not to safeguard my well-being, but to strip me of every last right I had over my own life, transforming me into a living corpse. Just as the pen's tip was about to touch the paper, my own execution warrant, I noticed Daniel's impatiently twitching knee and the beads of ambition sweat collecting at his temple. A primal surge of survival shot through me. I loosened my fingers on purpose and let the pen clatter to the floor. "Oh, Daniel, my dear boy, these old eyes can't read a thing anymore. I left my glasses in the bedroom. How can I sign something I haven't read? Your father would never forgive me." I slipped instantly into the role of the confused, helpless old woman. The flicker of naked frustration and anger that passed across Daniel's face proved I had made the smartest move possible. Ignoring his irritated, manipulative protest, "Mum, why do you need glasses? I'm your son. Don't you trust me?" I walked toward my bedroom, closed the door, and silently slid the bolt across. I leaned against the door, breathless, because everything inside that room, the papers, the staged politeness, the rushed urgency, was not bureaucracy. It was an attempted heist. Right then and there, I made a decision. Even if my hands shook, even if my mind faltered, I would never, ever sign away this house. If it came to it, I would swallow the pen before letting its ink bind me to my own destruction. With my heart pounding so violently it felt ready to burst through my ribs, I pressed my ear to the cold wood. I heard Daniel on the other side hissing through clenched teeth, "Age, honestly, going on about these damn glasses. She'll drive me insane." I listened to his fist thump against the wall, and in that echo I finally understood. The thin veil of respect he still pretended to have for me had torn completely. Standing outside that door was no patient son, but a frustrated, greedy trader panicking at the thought of losing his prey. I opened the door just a sliver and stepped into the corridor, my face twisted into the mask of a dizzy, frail woman barely able to stand. Looking straight into Daniel's expectant eyes, I let my voice tremble. "Son," something heavy came over me all of a sudden. My vision is blurred. Maybe my blood pressure spiked. In this state, I can't read or hold a pen. You'll have to excuse me today. I knew that lie was my only shield, and that my staggering steps, my near collapse, were the best and most vital performance of my entire life. Instead of showing concern or fetching me a glass of water, Daniel groaned with bitter annoyance. "Oh, for God's sake, Mum, we were just about to finish this. Now it'll all be delayed again." He snatched the cursed documents from the table, crumpling them as if punishing them for my refusal, and shoved them angrily into the man's briefcase.
In that moment, I realized something painfully clear. My health meant less to him than a signature. If I had a heart attack at his feet, his only worry would be whether my shaking hand could still produce a wet ink signature before I passed out. When I heard their footsteps fade down the stairwell, the hunched, weak, dizzy woman I had played just moments before vanished instantly. She dissolved into thin air. In her place stood a woman with a straight spine, sharp eyes, and a mind working like a blade, watching from behind the curtain as her enemies got into their car. Because we had only won a small skirmish, the real war had just begun. And next time, I knew I forgot my glasses wouldn't be enough. I needed to act before they did. I needed a move so decisive and unshakable that it would bury their plans for good.
After driving my son and that cursed solicitor out of my doorway, I shed the costume of the sick and helpless old woman like an unwanted cloak and headed straight to the dusty, book-cluttered office of the only person left in this world I could trust, my late husband's closest friend, Mr. Harold Whitmore, a solicitor who had known me since the day I married. As I stepped inside, my cheeks burned with shame, not because of anything I had done, but because admitting a child's cruelty is, for a mother, like confessing her own failure. Speaking aloud the truth that her son is ungrateful is the same as admitting that her years of sacrifice had come to nothing, that her love had been wasted. When I finally looked into Mr. Whitmore's fatherly, concerned eyes and told him one trembling sentence after another about Daniel's schemes to get my signature, the horrifying conversation I overheard that night, and their plan to bury me alive in a care home, the words poured from my mouth like thick, bitter tar. As I placed the deed and my meager savings onto his desk, I realized they were not just financial assets. They were my survival ticket, my last lifeline, and if I wanted to protect them, I would have to wage a legal war against my own child, against the very flesh of my flesh. When Mr. Whitmore placed in front of me an emergency injunction, one that would legally prevent anyone from touching my property without my express consent, and a new draft will designed to ensure that after my death, nothing would fall into the hands of those ungrateful vultures, I felt a strange coldness mix with the ink of my signature. This signature was not to disinherit my son out of spite. It was a silent scream, a sharp slap meant to teach that arrogant man who saw his mother as a burden just how heavy, immovable, and sacred that burden really was. As I descended the steps of the law office, the weight of those newly signed documents in my bag felt less like a load and more like invisible armor. I knew that the next time I faced Daniel, I would not be the trembling, confused woman dodging signatures with excuses about glasses. I would be standing tall, a property owner, armed with the sword of law and justice, ready to defend what was mine. Because where mercy ends, reckoning begins, and I had just opened my ledger. Only a few hours after returning from the law office, my fortress reinforced, the name Daniel lit up on my phone again, and I knew instantly. The furious man from the morning, the one thumping my walls with his fists, had vanished. In his place stood the dutiful son persona, honeyed voice, poisoned intent. And sure enough, when I answered, he cooed, "Mom, I'm so sorry for earlier. You were unwell. Your blood pressure was all over the place. Come round for dinner tonight. The kids miss you. Let's make peace. Let's eat something sweet and talk sweetly." It wasn't an apology. It was a predator switching tactics. I accepted their invitation with the naive softness of a mother who knows nothing. "All right, darling, I'll come." But inside, I was preparing not for a family dinner, but for an infiltration. I was a spy about to step into enemy headquarters. I went to my bedroom, opened the wardrobe, and took out my best dress, the one that still smelled faintly of mothballs. Then I clasped around my neck the pearl necklace my late husband had given me on our 40th anniversary. I was not dressing to impress. I was armoring myself, because tonight I would sit at that table not as the bowed, needy old woman they expected, ready to sign anything placed before her, but as a cold, observant witness who would study their every glance, every lie, every trap. When I stepped out of the taxi at their grand Surrey villa, Emily, who only days before had sneered at my homemade pastry, threw herself at me as if she had been yearning for my embrace for decades. She pressed her perfume-soaked cheeks against mine and chirped, "Oh, Mum, welcome. We couldn't swallow a bite without you." Her false enthusiasm churned my stomach with disgust. I kept my arms stiff at my sides, like two wooden planks, refusing to reciprocate her theatrical embrace. She would not make an actress out of me in this circus. When we sat at their extravagant dining table, Daniel himself filled my plate with all my favorite dishes, trying to erase the memory of the glasses crisis that had ruined his morning. He repeated, "Mum, you're the crown of our family. Everything we do is for your comfort." But my eyes wandered to my grandchildren, glued to their tablets, not even bothering to say, "Hello, Grandma." And in that moment, I understood. There was no love in this house. Love had died long ago. Only the ugly bargaining of self-interest remained. And every bite Daniel placed on my plate was not a gesture of affection, but a poisoned bait designed to choke me into signing my own ruin.
When the dishes were cleared, and it was time for those bitter after-dinner coffees, Daniel dragged his chair so close that its legs screeched against the marble floor. He placed his icy hand over mine, locked his eyes into my eyes, and said, "Mum, let's forget this morning's hiccup. We're only trying to help you. Look, Emily brought the file again. Why don't you sign while you have your dessert? Then we can all relax and live peacefully." In that moment, the curtain on the happy family dinner act dropped with a thud, and the stage was once again taken over by that cold, ruthless negotiation dressed in family clothing. Before signing the file that was nothing less than my death warrant, I turned toward my grandchildren, still glued to their cursed screens, and with a trembling voice asked, "My darlings, Grandma may not be able to visit again. They might send me to a care home. Won't you give me a hug? Won't you at least say goodbye?" My eldest grandson didn't even lift his head. He merely shrugged and muttered, "Gran, I'm in the best part of my game. I'll see you later, yeah?" His indifference, pure, effortless, and cutting, wounded me deeper than Daniel's betrayal ever had. Because in that moment I saw it clearly. My blood ran in their veins, but not a single trace of my spirit lived in their souls. They had learned only to take, consume, ignore, just like their father. I slowly withdrew my hand from beneath Daniel's controlling grip, pushed the file toward Emily with only the tip of my finger, as though touching something filthy, and this time, without pretending, looked straight at Daniel and said, Not tonight, Daniel. A decision this serious cannot be made over pudding. I will think about it. Perhaps I'll let you know once I'm home." The color drained from Daniel's face. The muscles in his jaw twitched with rage. I even noticed Emily nudge his leg under the table, signaling him to do something. But I rose from the table with the dignity of a queen. I refused their offer of a taxi and said, "My road is long, children. I can look after myself. Enjoy your dessert." As I walked out of that golden prison, I knew I wasn't leaving behind just an unsigned paper. I was leaving behind the last crumbs of my unconditional love for them. On the old, rattling council bus I took home, escaping the gilded cage they called a house, I watched the city's dark veins pulse through the night, and as I stared at my tired reflection in the window, I realized the woman looking back at me was no longer the mother who waited at the door for her son. She was a lone warrior, heartbroken, cold-blooded, but fiercely determined to survive, against the child who had pointed a gun at her spirit. The moment I returned to my refuge, my home, I locked the door behind me. Then, with an instinctive fear like an animal sensing a predator, I dragged my heavy furniture to form a barricade. This terror was not of burglars or strangers. It was of my only son entering with his spare key, dragging me from my bed like an object and delivering me to that care home like a parcel. The shame of having to defend myself from my own blood was so deep that it made my bones ache. When my phone lit up in the darkness like the eye of a monster, and I read Daniel's vile, threatening messages, "Mum, you've completely lost your mind. If you don't sign willingly, I'll get a court order saying you're mentally unfit, and I'll become your deputy. Then, even if you beg, I won't listen." At that moment, my blood turned to ice. Daniel's inner child, the boy I once rocked to sleep, was utterly gone. I stopped mourning him, because the creature sending those messages was no longer someone to grieve. He was an enemy, and enemies must be dealt with in the only language they understand: power and strategy. I replied nothing, not a single word. I turned off the phone completely and let him drown in his own fury. After checking once more that the deed and my savings was still safely hidden inside the jar of lentils in the kitchen cupboard, I sat in my old armchair by the window, my watchtower. I didn't blink until morning. I watched the street like a soldier guarding a fortress. Fear slowly melted away, replaced by a cold, steady resolve. And as dawn crept over London, I felt a strange, sharp anticipation rising within me. Because soon, very soon, Daniel would discover the surprise Mr. Whittemore and I had prepared, the revised will, and when he did, it would hit him across the face like a thunderous, righteous slap.
Just after dawn, while the prayers I whispered into the pitch-black night were still warm on my lips, the house shook under violent, merciless pounding on my door. When I peered through the pee-hole and saw my own son standing there with two hulking men beside him, holding what looked like emergency transfer papers, as though he had come to collect a criminal, I understood with a horror so deep it froze my blood. Daniel was not merely trying to force me out of my home. He was prepared to trample my mind, my will, my humanity, and have me dragged away, branded insane, into one of those bleak psychiatric units. As I stood trembling behind the barricade of furniture I had pushed against the door, I listened to his shameless voice echo down the street. "Daniel, open the door! Stop making this difficult! The doctors are here for you! We're doing this for your own good!" His shrill, self-righteous performance, this grotesque mask of concern, made my stomach churn. Beneath that mask was rot, a rotten soul that saw his own mother not as a human being, but as an obstacle to property he wanted. Fear burned away, replaced by something sharper than any terror. A mother's deepest disappointment, honed into icy fury. I would not bow. I would not be bullied. Not one more inch. I opened the door only as far as the security chain would allow, just a narrow slit, and thrust toward him the documents I'd obtained the day before. The official mental capacity assessment confirming I was of sound mind, and the complaint drafted for the Crown Prosecution Service. I looked straight into Daniel's red, furious face and shouted, "Daniel, you thought I was senile, but I acted before you. This paper will tear apart your lies, your false witnesses, and your filthy scheme in court. Now take your hired thugs and get away from my door immediately." Even I was startled by the strength in my own voice. And when Daniel saw the document, the very weapon he that tried to use against me now wielded against him, I watched through that tiny gap the confidence drain from his face. His expression crumpled into foolish confusion and fear. He stammered, glanced helplessly at the two men behind him, then muttered, "We're leaving." Watching my own son retreat with his tail between his legs was like swallowing broken glass. Because yes, I had protected my home, but I had lost my son, the tiny baby I once rocked in my arms forever. Moments after he left, I wiped the mother from my eyes and walked to the bank, not as a mother, but as a wounded woman, carrying nothing but logic and pride. Standing on that cold marble floor, I realized with bitter irony that all the money I had saved by sacrificing my own comforts for Daniel's wedding, for Daniel's home, for my grandchildren's schooling, had become loot that needed protection from Daniel himself. As I filled out the beneficiary change form, every time my pen crossed out the name Daniel Mills, I felt as though I were severing not just a legal tie, but the invisible umbilical cord between us. 40 years of shared life, history, blood. Because forcing a mother to remove her child from her will is a grief far heavier than burying a child. It is a grief that burns from the inside, like a brand on the soul. And when the procedures were done and I handed the account documents to Mr. Whittemore so he could lock them in a safe Daniel would never reach, an enormous weight lifted from my shoulders. But in its place came a cavernous, echoing emptiness inside me. That money no longer represented a future. It was simply a pile of paper, stripped of meaning, ownerless, homeless, soulless. And though I did not yet know who would inherit it one day, I knew with absolute certainty who would not. When I stepped out on the gray, rain-soaked streets of the city, letting the falling rain wash the invisible tears from my face, I noticed a young girl rummaging through a rubbish skip, pulling out wet cardboard, her clothes drenched and torn. I stared at her. Life's cruel joke suddenly struck me. On one side, a son drowning in wealth, yet exploiting his own mother. On the other, a child scraping through mud to earn a piece of bread with dignity. And in that moment, something shifted. A new door opened inside my mind. With a soft click, I could almost hear.
When I held my umbrella over that young girl, her hands purple from the cold as she struggled to save those wet cardboard boxes that were her day's earnings, I saw something in her frightened, helpless eyes that struck me like lightning. It was everything Daniel no longer had: humility, decency, humanity. And in that moment, I felt the hardened shell around my maternal instinct begin to crack. A flood of compassion poured out of me toward this stranger, this child life had thrown into the mud. I took her gently by the arm and led her into a warm bakery. As she wrapped her hands around the hot cup of tea I placed before her and smiled with a light that seemed to brighten the whole room, she repeated, "Thank you so much, Auntie. Thank you, as if I'd handed her the world." And I realized with a painful tightening in my throat that in all my years of giving Daniel everything, fortune, comfort, opportunity, I had never heard even one sincere word of gratitude. Gratitude, I understood then, isn't bought with money. It is born from a person's soul. The girl told me her name was Aisha. She spoke in a trembling voice about growing up without a father, caring for her ill mother, and collecting cardboard after school to help fund her dream of becoming a doctor. As I noticed the thick medical textbooks sticking out of her torn rucksack and rain-soaked shoes on her feet, my mind flashed to the days Daniel cried because his shoes weren't designer enough. Shame washed over me, hot and heavy. Life hands out gold platters to those who squander them while burying diamonds like this girl under piles of misery. I could no longer bear to stand by. When we left the bakery, I hugged her tightly, perhaps for the first time in my life, embracing someone not bound to me by blood. And the scent of rain and soot on her clothes felt cleaner, warmer, more genuine than the cold, expensive perfumes Daniel's wife drenched herself in. As my fingers brushed against the bank book in my handbag, a thought struck me like a bolt of truth. My inheritance belongs not to the vultures waiting for my death, but to the eagles who climb life with their own claws. The next day, unsure whether the seed of compassion planted in my heart was a passing impulse or a divine sign, I dragged my old legs to the university's medical campus. I stood beneath a great oak across the road, watching from a distance.
After Daniel's betrayal, my trust in people was so shattered that I found myself scrutinizing even this young girl's innocence, as if I were a detective verifying her soul. I watched as a classmate spilled out of the gates laughing, heading toward trendy cafes and busy nightlife. Aisha, meanwhile, lowered her head and slipped into a cheap corner store. At the till, she counted the coins in a trembling palm, embarrassed, buying only a loaf of bread and a small carton of milk. And in that moment, the gaping chasm between Daniel's tantrums over out-of-season shoes and this girl's struggle over pennies hit me like a blow. Money in the hands of the greedy becomes a weapon. Money in the hands of the pure becomes a cure. I followed her through narrow, damp alleyways, heavy with the scent of poverty. When she entered a crumbling flat with peeling walls and a leaking roof, I stood outside and listened. The moment she called out in her bright, hopeful voice, "Mom, look, I brought milk, and I learned such wonderful things at school today. I'm going to make you better, I promise." I collapsed on the cold pavement and cried silently. The warmth, devotion, and honesty I had longed to hear in my own mansion-like prison had been hidden all along in this broken home. When I finally walked away from that neighborhood of hardship but immense humanity, the fog in my mind lifted completely. My heart found its compass again. With trembling fingers, I dialed Mr. Harold Whitmore. "Lucy, prepare the papers. My money will not rot in a grave with me. It will be reborn in the hands of a doctor. I have found my heir." The words left my mouth with the weight of truth, righteousness, and peace.
When my solicitor, Mr. Harold Whitmore, spread that white sheet of paper across his mahogany desk, the one marked Last Will and Testament, I stared at it, knowing it was not simply a legal document. It was the scale on which two destinies were being weighed, the son I had torn from my heart and the girl I had held to it. And for the first time, the balance felt fair. As the tip of my pen moved toward the line beneath the words, "Beneficiary, Aisha," a flash of Daniel's innocent childhood smile pierced my chest, his small voice once saying, "Mummy, I'll never leave you." But just as quickly the memory shattered beneath the echo of his newer voice, "Your money isn't enough for us. Just die and be done with it." Ice flooded my veins, and with a firm, steady, unshaking stroke, I signed the document, burying my biological son in the past and bequeathing my future to the child of my soul. When the ink dried, I handed Mr. Whitmore a sealed envelope, the letter I had written for Aisha. In it, I explained why I loved her without knowing her and why I was placing such a burden, such a blessing on her shoulders. "This must remain secret until the day I die, Harold," I told him. "If she knows now, her pride will reject it. I'm not giving her charity. I'm giving her the life she deserves. Because true righteousness requires silence. Goodness that seeks applause is merely vanity in disguise." Just as I stepped out of that peaceful office, ready to begin my new life, my phone buzzed. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. When I answered and heard his same insistent, shameless voice, "Mom, what have you done? Are you signing the papers or not? We're struggling too, you know." The old me would have exploded in rage, but now there was only a cold, strange pity inside me.
and with a calmness that could slice stone, I replied, "I'm thinking, Daniel. Everything has its time, and justice will find its place." He had no idea he was walking straight into the greatest and bitterest shock of his life. After leaving the office, I went to the council estate where Aisha lived. At the corner shop, I asked to see the ledger page where her debts were recorded. When I paid off that amount, so trivial to me yet a mountain to her, I felt a fulfillment I had never known, even on the days I bought Daniel new cars. There is a sacred nourishment that comes only from feeding an orphan, a quiet and profound joy that shook me to my very core. Through the shop window, I saw Aisha collapse to her knees when she heard the news, covering her face, weeping tears of relief, looking up to the sky and praying for the unknown angel who had lifted her burden. I had given so little, but in her world it became a son, and seeing that, I remembered the way Daniel had turned up his nose even at gifts worth thousands. The decision I had made carved itself into my heart like a permanent seal. When I returned to my street, I found not the proud, polished businessman I once knew, but a crumpled man, tie loosened, shoulders sunken, eyes dull with defeat, sitting on my doorstep. Daniel, my son, reduced to ashes by the very fire he had lit. Seeing him like that hurt, of course it hurt, because I once placed the entire world at this child's feet. But I also knew, with a cold numbness spreading through me, that I no longer had a hand to extend to him, no more mercy to give, no more strength to save him from the pit he had dug for himself. When he fell to his knees, clutching at my legs the way he did as a child, sobbing, "Mom, I'm ruined. I've lost everything. If you don't sign those papers, they'll destroy me. Please, I'm begging you." I looked down at him, this grown man undone by his own greed, and realized even in his tears he did not see me. He saw only the signature that would save his own skin. And so the last ember of motherly tenderness inside me died. I did not bend. I did not touch him. I did not comfort him. I simply looked at him, a long, deep, silent look, and in that silence told him everything. The storm you planted has come for its harvest. When I let my son into the house, my son who now trembled on the doorstep like a stray dog, stripped of every trace of the proud businessman he once pretended to be, it wasn't mercy that guided my hand. It was the final alms of motherhood. As he sat on the edge of the very sofa he once dismissed as old and ready for the bin, I found myself staring at the divine irony of it all. The man who used to stride in here without wiping his shoes now clung to the dust of the carpet as if it were his last refuge. Yet the faint ache in my heart wasn't for him. It was for the mother who once raised him wrong. Even as he took the glass of water I handed him, his hands trembling, eyes darting everywhere but at mine, he still clung to his rehearsed lies. "Mom, let's sell this house. I swear, I'll buy you a mansion just one last time. I promise. Just help me this once." Even in desperation, he saw me not as a human being, but as an asset, a check, a purse to be emptied, gold to be melted down. Even drowning in his own chaos, he could not climb out of the pit of his greed. His frantic monologue about money, breathless, endless, was too much. I raised my hand sharply, slicing the air like a blade, and silence fell. I looked straight into his eyes, into the dark corridors of his soul, and said, "Daniel, you're asking for money, but if I give it to you, I would be your ruin, because you are trying to stand without ever having learned to fall. You love spending without ever earning. And if I sign those papers today, I will not be saving you. I will be throwing you off the cliff with your own arrogance." It was the first real no I had ever given him in his entire life. And it felt heavy, but necessary. At once, the desperate beggar vanished, and the snarling creature returned, baring his teeth. "What kind of mother are you? Are you throwing your own son into the fire? Will you take your money to the grave?" And in that moment, I understood again. He didn't call me mother. He called my wallet mother. So I pointed to the door and said, "Yes, Daniel. Sleep on the streets if you must. Go to prison if you must. But learn to walk without crushing others beneath your feet. I have no money left for you, and not a single tear." We both knew then that the invisible umbilical cord between us had snapped forever. Weeks passed, silent, heavy as lead. One morning, as I walked through the noise of the local market, I overheard women whispering behind me. "Have you heard? Faria's boy, bailiffs raided his house, and his fancy wife left him. A mother's worst nightmare, her child's downfall, being chewed like gossip gum between neighbors." It burned like acid in my chest, but I held my head high and walked on, though it felt like carrying mountains on my back. Even after everything, a mother's feet betray her heart. Before I knew it, I found myself at the gates of his luxury Surrey development. Behind the iron bars, I saw the bailiff's trucks parked before the grand villa he once bragged as his palace. I watched as the leather sofas he loved so much, the enormous television, the expensive furniture, all were hauled out like trash and thrown into the lorry. But I knew the bailiffs weren't just taking objects. They were stripping away his fake prestige, his illusion of grandeur, his castle built on vanity and lies. Piece by piece, I watched it collapse. Then, chaos erupted. Emily, my daughter-in-law, rushed out of the house with her most expensive suitcases, fleeing like a rat from a sinking ship. Daniel chased her, grabbed her arm, begged her not to leave. She pushed him away like he was a stray insect, got into a taxi, and vanished. And in that moment, I saw the truth laid bare. She had never loved Daniel. She had loved Daniel's money. Now that the money was gone, so was she. Left behind was nothing but a broken man on the pavement. When he dropped to the ground, knees on the cold stone, head buried in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably, I felt an ancient mother voice whisper inside me, "Run, Faria, lift your child, hold him." But my legs were heavy as concrete, because I knew this fall was not his end. It was the beginning of the long, brutal road where he might finally learn to be human. I wiped away the last tear I'd ever shed for him.
and with our heart torn but unwavering, I turned my back and left him alone with the ruins he had built himself.
4 long seasons had passed since my son's great collapse and my own harsh winters of loneliness. Now, sitting quietly in the shadowy corner of this vast auditorium, making myself invisible amid the hum of the crowd, I watched the young graduates lined up on the stage, their gowns gleaming under the lights. Among them stood the girl who once gathered soggy cardboard in the rain, that timid sparrow, now transformed into a proud eagle, a newly qualified doctor sworn to save lives. In that moment, I felt richer than any deed, any bank account, any earthly possession could ever make me. When the announcer's deep voice echoed through the hall, "Dr. Aisha," and that girl, risen from mud and hardship, lifted her diploma to the sky like a victory flag, I felt warm tears slide down my cheeks. These were not the tears I shed at Daniel's graduation years ago, tears tinged with selfish pride. My son will be successful. He will take care of me. No, these were tears of purity, of ego stripped away. This time, I thought, this girl will heal thousands. The world will be better because she exists. A victory untainted by self-interest. As the crowd dispersed, I watched from afar as Aisha ran to her wheelchair-bound mother, who looked up to her daughter with indescribable pride. My girl has made it. And suddenly, my mind carried me across the city to a small industrial estate where my son, Daniel, now worked, not in a luxury office, but on the greasy floor of an auto repair shop, learning life honestly from the very bottom. And in my heart, I whispered, "Now, my son, now you are finally growing." I was about to slip unnoticed into the night, back to my quiet kingdom, when Aisha's sharp doctor's eyes spotted me through the crowd. She ran to me, her gown fluttering behind her. My walls of anonymity collapsed. In front of everyone, she bent down, kissed my hand, and said, "Mom, I wouldn't be here without you. This diploma truly is yours." And when she embraced me, I felt every cell in my body tremble with the truth. Blood may bind bodies, but real family is made of those who bandage each other's wounds. Now, in the dimming twilight of my life, my knees weakening, my once reliable memory drifting in and out, Aisha hovers at my bedside. She listens to my breathing at night, warms my trembling hands between hers, and scolds me softly, "Mom, if you don't drink your soup, you won't get better." And each time I look at her, I cannot help but marvel at the lesson fate carved into my life. The son born from my blood counted the days until he could lock me in a care home. The girl I found on the street, the one I pressed to my heart, has become my doctor, my companion, my walking stick. One day, the doorbell rang. Aisha opened it, and there stood Daniel.
the arrogance drained from his face, pride extinguished, shoulders slumped, holding nothing but a sad little bag of oranges, like a visitor too ashamed to enter. The storm of anger I once carried inside me had long since died. In its place was a strange, bittersweet calm, because the man standing there was no longer the greedy creature who wanted to sell my life out from under me. He was a wounded human being, humbled by life, softened by defeat, finally learning what mother truly meant. He lowered himself onto the chair beside my bed, careful and timid, as if afraid I might break. When he saw how tenderly Aisha cared for me, his eyes filled with tears. He bowed his head and whispered, "Mom, I didn't know your worth. I mistook diamonds for pebbles. You were right. This is real wealth." Hearing his confession didn't erase the scars in my heart, but it stopped the bleeding. A mother, before she leaves this world, wishes for one thing only: to see her child become a man. And though the price had been high, I was finally seeing it. I reached beneath my pillow and pulled out a yellowed childhood photograph, his tiny face beaming with innocence. I placed it into his calloused hands. I had no deeds left to give him, no savings, no inheritance of wealth, but I gave him the only legacy that mattered, the honor of standing on his own feet, and the living lesson in humanity that sat beside me, Aisha, whom he did not call sister, but now knew he must respect. When I leave this world, I will not leave behind two heirs at war. I will leave behind two separate stories, one who saves lives and one who learned life the hard way. And that was my peace.